fear that the Muslims are coming is a completely false narrative. In some ways, it's exactly the reverse. The Muslims have been here from the beginning. It's just that white society did not count them as human and did everything in their power to repress and wipe out that religious identity.
We are living in a time of real crisis of respect and civility. Words are being spoken, attitudes are being credentialed that are dangerous for our society. And we need to beat that back.
This is the most concerned I've ever been about the future of religious freedom in the United States. For the first time in my life, I think it actually could be reversed in a way that would tear us apart.
The fact of the matter is the world is changing. We either change with it or we get run over by it.
One thing that is exceptional about America is the fact that our systems are changeable, and that it's based on the people who are able to make that change.
CBS presents Religion and Democracy. The narrator is Rollin Smith. As one of the most diverse countries in the world, the United States has struggled with religious and ethnic intolerance throughout history.
Of course, we've been down this road before in the United States. Catholicism at one time was considered a great threat in the 19th century and early 20th centuries to the United States. I mean, there were riots and fights and divisions, and we are doing that again with Islam. World conditions are such that people have fear. They have fear about terrorism and extremism, and they often look inward to their own country. This happened during the period of anti-communism. We were concerned about communism around the world, but in our country, people started to be worried about the enemy within. So we've had a pattern of this in American history where we begin to look around for someone to blame, someone to strike out at.
According to a report by the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University, in 2015, there were 174 incidents of violence and vandalism against Muslims in America. Hate crimes are fueled in part by Islamophobia, an exaggerated fear and hostility toward Muslims.
When you look at Islamophobia, you can actually document an industry. You have millions of dollars funneled into specific foundations and specific outlets that manufacture this fear.
There are a small number of groups in the United States with tremendous amounts of money who've been spending years, since 9/11 especially, trying to educate the American public about Islam. That Islam is evil, Islam is violent, Islam is the problem, Islam produces terrorists. Most people are educated about Islam from propaganda, and as a result, Islamophobia has taken hold in America.
One of the greatest misconceptions about Islam is that it promotes violence.
There's violence and extremism in the name of Islam all over the world. So people think that must be the problem. If people know Muslims, they're very much less likely to say that Islam is the problem or Muslims are the problem. They know that a Muslim is not a terrorist because of one's faith. And that in fact, these extremist groups have appropriated Islam just like the KKK and white supremacists have appropriated Christianity.
Those who condone violence give political, not religious justifications for that position. So what violence there is born out of political realities, not religion.
While anti-Muslim sentiment spiked during the run-up to the Iraq War, research shows Islamophobia is most widespread during election cycles.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
It's the highest level of irresponsibility that may win them some votes in their party, but what it's doing is creating a climate of fear and intimidation. It feeds the narrative that we have an enemy within.
According to the Bridge Initiative, there were 53 attacks on Muslims in December of 2015 alone. It was around the same time that anti-Islam rhetoric was increasing on the campaign trail.
Islamophobia is a threat to every American who cares about freedom because it manipulates us, it causes us to be afraid all the time.
What do we want?
Islamophobia has a dehumanizing effect on Muslims and other religious minorities. Research shows that when people see others as less than human, they are less sympathetic and more aggressive to that community.
It opens the psychological space for hate crimes. It also opens the psychological space for government policies that are discriminatory. They have been so otherized that our values and our constitutional principles don't seem to apply to the Muslim community. And I think that's a real danger to not only this community, but to America as a whole.
It affects us all because if a group is afraid to practice its faith openly, to be identified with its faith, if they have to look over their shoulder, there is no religious freedom. People aren't free if they're afraid. People have been killed because they look like Muslims in the United States. Sikh temples have been attacked and vandalized because people thought, oh, this must be Muslim. I think we're actually in a very dangerous moment in the United States. We now no longer are just pretending that we all get along. We're actually not getting along. And we are alienating people from one another.
And it is affecting children. According to the Council on American-Islamic Relations, 55% of Muslim students between the ages of 11 and 18 are bullied in school.
It's also just the daily assault on their identity by what they hear on TV. They are, for the first time, feeling like this is not a country that they're welcomed in, even though it's the only country they know.
So who are our Muslim neighbors? It's estimated that there are 3.3 million Muslims living in America today, compared to 1.6 billion worldwide. They are one of the most racially diverse faith groups in America.
They're the only faith group with no majority race. They're about equal portions African American, Arab American, and Asian American, and the remainder of a big mix of everyone else. About half are immigrants, half were born here.
Muslims have been part of America's religious tapestry since before the country was founded. Muslim slaves were brought to America through the transatlantic slave trade in the early 1500s. It's estimated that 15 to 20% of the slave population were Muslim.
Most of them were forced to convert to Christianity. However, it was often known that the Muslim slaves, a lot of them were literate and thus had kinds of education that the slave owners often valued. And so a number of Muslim slaves found themselves in positions of power or authority in different plantations, and it's thus that we come to know some of their stories.
Among them was a man by the name of Yaro Mahmoud. Born in Guinea, he was brought to the United States in 1752. After being enslaved for nearly 40 years, he was freed.
He managed to earn enough money to buy his own home and start a business. He was actually a shareholder in a local bank here in Washington, D.C. And he came to the attention of Charles Willson Peale, who's a famous painter. And Peale painted Yaro Mahmoud's portrait, and the portrait is a fascinating example of how Mahmoud maintained some of his Islamic identity. He fashioned for himself a kind of turban and a sort of ascot-like robe to indicate difference. And his portrait is this marvelous example of somebody who, despite 40 years of slavery, held keenly to his Muslim identity, and he remained a Muslim, a self-professed Muslim, all his life, was known as such.
Today's attacks on Muslims have prompted an outcry from leaders of other faith traditions who have faced bigotry and persecution throughout history.
We as Jews who have lived through anti-Semitism for centuries understand what happens when societies act out of fear. And here in America, living in a free democracy, we thrive on equal legal protection of all people, civic discourse in which all groups are represented fairly and equally. So when one minority group is attacked, we're all attacked. When one religious people is a victim, we're all victimized. And so as a Jew, I stand up with other Jews to speak out against Islamophobia or bigotry in any form against any group.
Coming up,
I think the only way to counter Islamophobia in the United States is to get serious about educating people about Islam and other religions.